my name is Brianna Figueredo, and I will be reviewing about Behaviorism by B.F. Skinner, Chapter 7, Thinking. I'm going to start by introducing the chapter, and each slide you will see has a couple of quotes that I thought were significant, and I go on to explain each chapter. Perceiving the world and gaining experience give you general purpose cognitive activities, abstract and conceptual thinking. According to the mentalist theory, these have no external reference. This chapter is going to discuss the behavioral processes which play a role in higher mental processes. The processes are going to be all under the field of thinking. In the introduction to the chapter, Skinner mentions that thinking is often referred to as behaving weakly. To think something is the opposite of to know something. So when we think something, it is reporting less explanation than if you know something. So an example of that might be, I think it's Wednesday versus I know it's Wednesday. There's more of an explanation when you know. Skinner goes on to say that covert behavior is completed behavior which occurs on a scale very small and cannot be easily detected by others. Covert behavior allows us to try behavior out and try it again if the private consequences are not reinforcing. So you can try the behavior again to be reinforced by it. Although covert behavior cannot be easily detected, it's not impossible, and it is definitely observable. Skinner says that methodological behaviorism neglects covert behavior because it is not objective, but it definitely is. Skinner then presents an argument that mental life and the world in which it is lived are inventions. He also says that thinking is behaving. And he'll go on to give examples of the process of how this is considered. The first section stated in the book is the cognitive control of stimuli. And Skinner says in this section that we pay attention or don't pay attention to certain things based on the importance that it has had for us in the past under similar circumstances. Skinner chooses the example of a traffic light. You might stop at a red light based on the fact that in the past you did not stop at the red light and you almost got into an accident. Skinner then goes on to say that forming concepts is also called cognitive. So by inventing concepts, it's hard to understand and explain behavior, but instead it may be easier to pursue the contingencies. Skinner gives the example of teaching a child what the equation 6 plus 3 equals. The children are taught that the answer is 9. However, when presented with 3 plus 6, some children are puzzled and don't know the answer, and some blurt out 9. Now, does this mean that the child understands the commutative property of addition, or does that mean that the child has been taught that 3 plus 6 equals 9? The next section in this chapter is search and recall, and Skinner starts out by saying that searching is reinforced by looking for something in the past and being reinforced by that something turning up. Skinner gives the example of an animal actively acting for food. The active hunt for food may be its genetic endowment, but the behavior of which that it is looking for the food in a familiar environment is dependent on the success of finding food in the past. The animal needs to look for food and in turn looks for where food has been found in the past. Skinner then goes on to talk about when people make copies of the world around them, and they also record what goes on in the world around them, and they store them in their mind for future use or to recall that information. By using these memories, the person can evoke a behavior appropriate to an earlier occasion and then permits them to respond more effectively. Then Skinner goes on to talk about stimulus control and how we behave in special ways under certain kinds of special stimulus control. Future stimuli are effective only if they resemble the stimuli which have been part of earlier contingencies. Skinner gives the example that an incidental stimulus can remind us of a person, place, or event if it has resembled that person, place, or event. Being reminded means to be made likely to respond, and possibly perceptually. For example, when hearing a name, you could be reminded of the person in the sense that now you see that person. But this doesn't mean that you make a copy of the person and then look at it. It means that you're behaving in a way that you behaved when you were in their presence in an earlier occasion. When you're searching for this information to recall, you're not searching your entire warehouse of information, but you can try to remember mnemonics or other different ways of learning that helped you remember what you want to recall. The next section in this chapter is solving problems. And a lot of the times people think of solving problems as more complex than it really is. A person has a problem when a condition will be reinforcing, but they don't have a response that will produce that reinforcement. They will then try to solve the problem, and by doing that, they'll emit a response which will then be reinforced. Skinner then goes on to say that whether problem solving arises from raw contingencies or from instruction by others, it is acquired in an overt form and can always be carried out at the overt level. Next, Skinner will talk about solving problems by choice, and a choice arises when two or more responses appear to be possible to a person, and they have to choose or decide among them. And the key to making a choice is to stray from indecisiveness, and discover the effective response. When presented with possible choices to make, and the consequences are equal, the problem must be solved with a choice or solving it by escaping indecision and possibly changing the setting. When it is said that people can make choices and they like to make choices, it is simply meaning that when any decision-making behavior strengthens one response, it makes the other response unlikely and then is reinforced. The next section in the chapter is titled Creative Behavior, and in this, Skinner explains that when accidental traits are learned by their contribution to survival, it is similar to say that accidental behavior is learned by their reinforcing consequences. Creative thinking is largely concerned with the production of mutations or accidental happenings. In determinism, this leaves no room for chance, but there have been many people who also say that this accidental behavior leads to the production of original behavior. Original or creative behavior is dependent on the setting and the topography of the behavior, and it could be varied and the results may be reinforcing. Skinner gives the example of a painter who may change brushes or color of paint to create new textures, and he also gives the example of a mathematician who can set an equation to something, and maybe he will then get an invention or be successful in his equation. The next section in the chapter is the structure of the mind, and Skinner says that it's often been said that the structure and development of thinking have been metaphorically connected to that of horticulture. People often look closely to the growth of the mind. So the growth is cultivated by a teacher, as the growth of crops is cultivated by a farmer. However, what often gets overlooked is the development of the world that a thinking person is exposed. He goes on to say that it has been explained by people that study the development of language, that vocabulary, grammar, and the length of sentences have been used to determine development, but they don't say anything about the instances when a child hears language all the time and then uses the language himself. This can be compared to the growth of the mind. Seeing the behavior to indicate growth of the mind is important, but it's also crucial to know of the instances when the child uses those skills and develops new concepts. Features of the environment play a large role in the evolution of appropriate behavior, but contingencies of reinforcement are at work at all times to develop supplementary behaviors under the control of the same environmental features. Skinner says we must always look to the constructing environment and not the constructing mind. In the last section of the chapter, The Thinking Mind, Skinner explains that the mind is said to be the place where thinking occurs in a stream of consciousness, where one memory leads to another. He states that the mind examines sensory data, makes inferences about the outside world, stores and receives information, makes decisions, and it wills to act. Skinner then ends the chapter the way he started it, reiterating that human thought is human behavior. Thank you for watching my summary of Chapter 7 in About Behaviorism by B.F. Skinner. Please look in the description of this post to see the discussion question that I have chosen.